Welcome to the Classic Science Fiction Deep Dive. Today we're setting course for one of the most iconic journeys in television history, the launch of Star Trek, the original series in 1966, and that unforgettable first season that really redefined science fiction.
Yeah, it's a big one. And we've really dug into a pile of your source materials here. You've got episode reviews, character wikis, some pretty deep historical analyses, and these great production accounts like Inside Star Trek, The Real Story, and Living with Star Trek. Lots to unpack.
Exactly. And our mission today is to pull out the key insights from all that. We want you to walk away really understanding the show's origins, Roddenberry's vision, the hurdles it faced right at the start, and the impact it had almost immediately. Think of it as your fast track to being genuinely clued in on this absolute cornerstone of sci-fi.
Okay, let's get into it. And you really have to start with the creator, Gene Roddenberry. He's central to the whole thing.
Right, and the sources give us some interesting bits about his background. Like, before Trek, he worked on The Lieutenant. That's where he first worked with Leonard Nimoy, right?
That's right, yeah. And Gary Lockwood, too.
Mm.
And that experience, it definitely shaped how he approached Star Trek.
Mhm.
One big takeaway from the material is how deliberate he was about crafting his own public image around the show. Like, apparently he was presenting it at the 1966 World Science Fiction Convention before it even aired. Screened both pilots there.
Both The Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Yeah. And later, he got Science Fiction Writers of America members involved, sort of building support.
And it seems he was also pretty careful about how he told the story of making the show. The sources suggest he sometimes painted the NBC execs and censors as the main villains, the ones trying to compromise his grand vision.
Which brings us to the context. You have to remember, this is the 1960s. It's crucial. The sources really hammer home how the show reflected the Cold War, the Federation versus the Klingons, that dynamic.
A clear allegory there.
Absolutely.
Mm.
But it wasn't just geopolitics. The show was explicitly trying to tackle race and, well, the whole idea of pluralism, really pushing the envelope for TV back then.
Though the material points out, while that was the goal, the actual execution in the stories could be a bit uneven, sometimes even contradictory.
Definitely. And just getting the show on the air was, well, a struggle. The sources go into the early production headaches, like NBC turning down the first pilot, The Cage.
But they didn't just kill it completely, right? They asked for another pilot.
Exactly, yeah. Where No Man Has Gone Before, which shows you something. And it also shows Roddenberry's persistence, like how he fought to cast Majel Barrett as #1 in The Cage. NBC shot that down, and the character was dropped. And Spock. Casting Spock was another huge battle. Roddenberry was set on Leonard Nimoy. The sources mention his saturnine face and introspective appearance.
That specific look.
Right. But NBC and the sales teams, they were, and this is a quote, anti-ear. Anti-Spock, can you believe it? Anti-ear.
Seriously? Over the ears?
Apparently. They okayed him for the pilot, but basically said, we'll fight about this later. Just wild, the things they argued about.
It really shows the weird, behind-the-scenes stuff. And it wasn't just casting, practical things, too. The sources say the Enterprise bridge set from the pilots looked great, sure, but it was clumsy to film in. Not enough of it was wild, sections you could remove easily for cameras.
Just load things right down.
Yeah. And apparently pigeons outside the studio were making noise and interrupting filming. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing in space.
Not at all. And here's something really surprising from the sources, given its later success. Paramount viewed the original run as a monetary failure. A failure.
No way.
Yeah. They actually offered to sell Roddenberry their entire financial stake in the show for about $150,000 after that first run.
Wow. And he couldn't afford it.
Could sway it. He even offered his claim to his ex-wife instead of alimony, and she turned it down.
That's incredible. It just shows how little faith anyone had in its long-term financial prospects back then. What was his salary?
Sources say $85,000 a year for that first season. Decent money then, sure,
Yeah.
but nowhere near enough for that kind of buyout.
So a huge insight there is just how wrong the studio, and maybe even Roddenberry himself, were about its eventual value, based purely on those initial numbers.
Completely missed the mark.
Okay, so speaking of value and legacy, that opening, space, the final frontier.
Instantly iconic.
Oh, yeah. Sets the whole mood. The sources mentioned it evolved a bit. John D.F. Black had an initial idea, but Roddenberry revised it, added more of that dramatic sweep and sense of purpose.
And that narration combined with the visuals, it just immediately locks in the show's whole philosophy, doesn't it? Exploration, ethics, humanism. and this real powerful optimism.
That's a core insight, absolutely. Star Trek's utopian message was very intentional. Roddenberry's whole concept, as the sources explain it, was infinite diversity and infinite combinations.
I beat you.
Idea. It wasn't just a slogan. It was aiming to promote this idea of a multicultural future reflecting the hopes and anxieties of the 60s.
And the sources really show how much that connected with viewers. You read these accounts of fan letters. People saw the show as a kind of blueprint for solving social problems like racism, poverty, war.
Yeah, they felt it kept alive a dream of a better world, which must have been incredibly powerful against the backdrop of things like the Vietnam War.
Using sci-fi was smart too.
Yeah.
It let them tackle these big social issues, putting contemporary problems into space dramas.
Like the Federation and Klingons mirroring the US and Soviet Union.
Exactly. And explore them in a way that maybe wouldn't make viewers immediately defensive compared to a straight drama doing it.
Yeah, it offered this vision of a future where humanity had, mostly gotten past its internal squabbles, which feels pretty different from a lot of future visions we see then, and maybe especially now.
So true.
And what's really striking is how personal it became for people. The sources talk about fans using the show, literally using it, to cope with really tough stuff. Bereavement, illness, disability.
Finding a network of support in the fandom that was starting to build, using specific episodes or characters to kind of guide them.
Exactly. There's this one story about a fan, Douglas Mayo, using Captain Kirk's determination as an example to help him recover after a bad car accident.
Wow.
It really drives home the point that fiction, especially this kind of humanistic sci-fi, can genuinely give people a framework for dealing with life, offering
It
hope.
brings us right to the characters, because that's where the connection really happens. The sources nail it, calling Kirk, Spock, and McCoy the holy trinity of Trek.
Absolutely. William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk. His first time on screen was actually The Man Trap, the first episode they aired.
And the sources track him through all 3 seasons, the movies, even the animated series, voice work.
Right. And obviously, the character lives on Chris Pine in the newer movies, Paul Wesley now in Strange New Worlds. The Kelvin films even gave him that different backstory, born during a starship battle.
Yeah, dramatic stuff.
But the core Kirk, the sources describe him as bold, intuitive. A key insight seems to be how he finds meaning. It's not just about command. It's about actively trying to make things better, taking on responsibility, even when it's a heavy weight.
Then there's Spock, Leonard Nimoy, the ultimate outsider. Right, that constant tension between logic and emotion.
And we already mentioned the production battles over him, especially the ears. Philosophically, though, the sources link his logic to ideas like stoicism, not being emotionless, but achieving that calm, that imperturbability.
Interesting.
And the whole mind meld concept gets attention, too. Some sources suggest it touches on philosophical ideas about the mind being an emergent property, something that arises from a complex system, like with the Horta, that silicon-based life from season 1.
The rock creature, yeah, that was a weird one. So using sci-fi to explore these deep ideas about consciousness.
Exactly. And it's funny, Nimoy apparently got quite annoyed when a studio memo suggested any good actor could play Spock. But NBC's own research showed he was actually the most popular character by far.
Shows what they knew. And Dr. McCoy, DeForest Kelley.
Also debuted in The Man Trap. And the sources point out he started with just a featuring credit. Only got bumped up to starring in season 2 thanks to producer Robert Justman pushing for it.
Kelley himself wasn't sure about the show at first, was he?
Not at all. He famously told Roddenberry it would be the biggest hit or the biggest miss God ever made. Quite the prediction. And like the others, he voiced McCoy in the animated series too.
So that's the big 3, but the rest of the bridge crew in season 1 were just as important for the show's feel.
Totally. You have Elty Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, communications officer, and the sources rightly stress her importance. One of the first Black women in such a prominent, professional, non-stereotypical role on American TV. Huge.
Absolutely groundbreaking. And George Takei as Elton Sulu. He was a physicist in the second pilot.
Yeah, started out as a science officer type, then became the helmsman we know.
Yeah.
And James Doohan as LT Commander Scotty, the miracle worker engineer, introduced in that second pilot too.
Can't forget Scotty. We also had Janice Rand, Grace Lee Whitney, the captain's yeoman for part of the season.
Right, she left midway through season 1. And Christine Chappell, the nurse, played by Mottle Barrett.
Who Roddenberry originally wanted as number 1.
Exactly. So she's still got a role, just a different one. But that core group, that diversity on the bridge, that was really part of the show's statement from the beginning.
So, season 1, It really set the template and gave us some classics right out of the gate.
It sure did. Kicked off September 8th, 1966 with The Man Trap. And yeah, some really memorable stories that give you a lot to think about.
Like the menagerie, such a clever move.
Totally. The sources explain how they just took all that expensive footage from the rejected pilot, The Cage, which was just sitting there gathering dust.
And built a whole new story around it to save money and use the material. Smart.
Very smart. Then there's Balance of Terror. Foundational stuff. First time we meet the Romulans. Sets up that whole tense submarine warfare in space vibe.
Established a major adversary. And Space Seed.
Crucial. Because that's where we first meet Khan Noonien Singh, who becomes, arguably the ultimate Trek villain later on.
Definitely looms large. But the sources spent a lot of time on the city on the edge of forever. And you can see why.
Oh, yeah. Reviews quoted called it pretty darn amazing, praised the good characterization, dialogue, and a real humdinger of a climax. Some called it one of the finest sci-fi stories ever written. High praise.
In the acting, too, right. Kelly's Mad McCoy breakdown, Joan Collins as Edith Keeler.
Definitely. But the core, the thing people still argue about, is that dilemma. Did Edith Keeler have to die to fix the timeline?
That's the crux of it, and the sources show this ongoing debate.
Right. You've got Mike Mears' argument saying the Guardian, the time portal thing, wouldn't let them come back unless history was set right. The portal was only there in that past moment.
Makes sense.
But then you've got Tony's counter-argument, basically saying, hey, nothing in the episode indicates that it wasn't possible to bring her to the future. Why couldn't they?
So the text itself leaves it ambiguous enough for fans to really dig in.
Exactly. And someone named Beth even questions the whole premise, like, historically, would one pacifist dying really change the U.S. entry into WWII? Were the Nazis that close to an A-bomb?
Interesting questions, but maybe beside the point.
Perhaps. Because the sources agree, the real power, the thrill of the episode, is all down to the human dilemmas presented. And the Guardian itself is fascinating, described as much a force of nature as a constructed piece of technology, this abstract presence, a unique kind of Trek monster.
A force, not just a creature. Okay, so beyond these standout episodes, what was the general reaction like in season 1? Was the network feeling the pressure?
Well, the fan mail was significant. The sources say NBC got 29,000 letters about Star Trek in that first season. Apparently that was second only to
The Monkees.
The Monkees. Wow, that's pretty good company, I guess. Shows passion, even if the ratings weren't huge, for sure. Now, the sources do mention Roddenberry's later stories about fan mail saving the show, sometimes citing huge numbers like 1 million letters for season 3. That seems inflated compared to an NBC director's account of maybe 12,000 letters around the season 2 potential cancellation point.
So the exact numbers and direct impact might be debated, but clearly there was a passionate core audience writing in.
Undeniably. And that early passion was just the seed for the massive cultural impact the show would have later.
Which is where the legacy really kicks in.
Yeah, a huge takeaway from the sources on Legacy is just how groundbreaking that interracial cast was. Uhura's importance as a symbol, not just a character, comes up again and again.
And the inspiration factor, we touched on it, but the sources confirm it inspired actual scientists, astronauts, engineers, people like Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman in space, pointing to Uhura. It really did seem to keep that dream of a better world alive for people and push them personally.
And then there's the fandom itself. Star Trek fandom really exploded after the show was canceled and went into syndication. That's when it found its massive audience, airing in the afternoons, becoming this cult phenomenon.
The numbers show it. By 72, it was in over 100 U.S. cities, 60 countries. And that led directly to the first big Star Trek convention in New York in 72. Over 3,000 fans showed up.
Huge. And fanzines became a massive thing, too, after the show ended. Fans writing their own stories, making art. They weren't just watching, they were participating, building a community.
Which provided that network of support we talked about. People used the show, its ideas, to connect and cope with real life.
The sources even bring up the movie Galaxy Quest as kind of reflecting that how these dedicated fan communities become like families and how that passion can inspire people.
That's a great connection. On a slightly different note, there's that odd detail in the sources about the theme music. Alexander Courage wrote it.
Right, but Roddenberry apparently wrote lyrics for it. Lyrics never used on the show specifically so he could claim co-composer credit and get royalties.
Oof. Courage wasn't happy about that, apparently.
No, the sources say he found it unethical. Just a reminder, even with utopian ideals, there were still some very down-to-earth, maybe less than ideal things happening behind the scenes.
Right. And one last practical point for people watching today. The sources mention the remastered versions from 2006 for the 40th anniversary with the updated CGI effects.
Yeah, so you have options for how you experience it now.
So when you look back at that whole first season, all the struggles, the groundbreaking ideas, the iconic characters taking shape.
It really was more than just a TV show, wasn't it? Star Trek, the original series, I mean, it felt like a blueprint, maybe a hopeful blueprint for a better future. And season one, despite everything, it gave us these bold, optimistic, truly enduring stories. It laid all the groundwork.
Absolutely. So in our next deep dive, we'll beam into season 2, see how the series evolved and deepened those themes. Until then, make sure you're subscribed to Classic Science Fiction. And as always, live long and prosper.